Hey everybody, I'm joined here with Veggies for Thought, who I think is now going by Food 5 Thought. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
He's a YouTuber like me. We both post rather infrequently. Um, and I thought we would get together because I really respect him, and we tend to have really good conversations together. So I figured, why don't we get together and make a list of some vegan topics and have a conversation about it? You want to like introduce yourself?
Yeah, like I just want to say, yeah, that's a really sweet introduction. Thanks for that. Yeah, like I've had some fruitful talks with you. Thanks for having me on, and yeah, I'm just looking forward to the talk then.
Cool, cool. And remember, he's a YouTuber, so you can go and visit his YouTube, but maybe don't expect frequent uploads at the minute. I don't know what your plans are.
Yeah, yeah. Right now it's yeah, less frequent uploads for sure.
Okay,
Quality over quantity.
yeah, exactly. I'm certainly not one to call you out. Okay, so the first question we had on the list here was, is speciesism viable? And I suppose what I meant by that is like, does speciesism lead to repugnant conclusions? Do we expect speciesism to go the way of racism and sexism? Like, is it qualitatively different in any way?
Uh-huh, yeah. So speciesism and the idea of speciesism. It's a really interesting. It's a really interesting topic. And if just before I could answer that, if I could just give some background on my attitude and like my
Sure.
what I've thought of this over time. So, with this, with the specific case of speciesism, as well as with other philosophical topics, oftentimes when I'm introduced to an idea, it can seem a bit absurd to me. And I hear some philosophical ideas that at first I just find almost funny if I don't understand them. But the funny
Hmm.
thing is that s- although sometimes my intuition intuitively gives me that kind of attitude towards some ideas like speciesism or something else, I might think that it's something ridiculous. But after giving it some thought, um, or reading about it some more, I actually end up adopting it and thinking that it's something reasonable. So right now with speciesism, this is something that at first my attitude towards it was I didn't really understand it. I couldn't really conceptualize it. But since we've had this talk coming up, I thought I'd do a bit more reading about it. And
Okay.
right now, I'm kind of in this gray area where I'm not really too sure what to think about it, and it really depends on what we mean by speciesism. So I first heard of speciesism, and sorry if I'm going on for too much.
No,
Like,
no,
feel
you
free to
go ahead.
interrupt me. Okay. So I first heard of speciesism. I think when people were making reference to Peter Singer using the word in like his book Animal Liberation. And hold on, there's someone who used the word before it. Have you heard of Richard Ryder and his original pamphlet or leaflet, I guess, on speciesism?
No.
Okay, so there's this guy called Richard Ryder who, um, like Peter Singer, he was also into the whole animal liberation movement. And I believe it was in the 1970s. He made this leaflet where he came up with the word speciesism. Like he was the original person to coin the term.
Okay.
And he handed this leaflet around Oxford University. And at the time, I believe Peter Singer was there as a graduate student. And he was one of the people who got one of these leaflets. And he ended up using the word speciesism, like in his book Animal Liberation.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so I've actually got the leaflet open here. Like it's just a page long. Maybe I could read it so we could get like an idea of what is meant by speciesism, or like what the original intention behind speciesism, behind using that word was, and then we could use some of these as talking points for answering that question.
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
Okay. So here's how it starts. Since Darwin, scientists have art. Sorry, let me restart that. Since Darwin, scientists have agreed that there is no magical essential difference between human and other animals biologically speaking. Why then do we make an almost total distinction morally? Oh, and hold on, let me actually send this to you so like you could uh, read along, and if there's like anything that you'd like to take note of, or like if you want to keep it on screen.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So if you just scroll down to where it says
Yeah,
speciesism,
yeah,
the
I'm
part
there.
in italics. Okay, so I'll just finish the first paragraph. If all organisms are on one physical continuum, then we should also be on the same moral continuum. The word species, like the word race, is not precisely definable. Lions and tigers can interbreed. Under special laboratory conditions, it may soon prove possible to mate a gorilla with a professor of biology. Will the hairy offspring be kept in a cage or a cradle? It is customary to describe Neanderthal man as a separate species from ourselves, one especially equipped for Ice Age survival. Yet most archaeologists now believe that this non human creature practiced ritual burial and possessed a larger brain than we do. Suppose that the elusive, abominable snowman, when caught, turns out to be the last survivor of this Neanderthal species. Would we give him a seat at the UN, or would we implant electrodes in his superhuman brain? I use these hypothetical but possible examples to draw attention to the illogicality of our present moral position as regards experiments with animals. About 5 million laboratory animals, more and more of them primates like ourselves, are killed every year in the UK alone, and numbers are now escalating out of control. There are only 12 Home Office inspectors. Quite apart from the right to live, one clear moral criterion is suffering, the suffering of imprisonment, fear, and boredom, as well as physical pain. If we assume that suffering is a function of the nervous system, then it is illogical to argue that other animals do not suffer in a similar way to ourselves. It is precisely because some other animals have nervous systems so like our own that they are extensively studied. The only argument in favor of painful experiments on animals are one, that the advancement of knowledge justifies all evils. Well, does it? And two, that possible benefits for our own species justify mistreatment of other species. This may be a fairly strong argument when it applies to experiments where the chances of suffering are minimal and the probability of aiding applied medicine is great, but even so, it is still just speciesism, and as such, it is a selfish, emotional argument rather than a reasoned one. If we believe it is wrong to inflict suffering upon innocent human animals, then it is only logical, uh, phylogenetically speaking, to extend our concern about elementary rights to the non human animals as well. Do not be afraid to express your views. Contact MPs, professors, editors about this increasingly important moral issue. Okay, so that was a bit of a long read, maybe a bit longer than I would have thought to read it. But yeah, I can imagine there are some points here. I can already see some points where you take issue with here. So do you want to just share some thoughts you have on this, or like
Well,
what points
yeah,
you'd take
like
issue with here?
you'd probably know that there's like some nitty-gritty details that I would get on to this, like whether or not we should be saying that suffering is just any sort of nerve system, whatever whatsoever, and then we get into a conversation about philosophy of mind, or but I think I think there's a lot of good in this writing, and that I don't want to really focus so much on those nitty gritty details that sort of just take us away from the speciesism talk in general. Uh, so I think it makes strong points. One is the not precisely definable, right? And this has been a charge that has been levied at me multiple times, because, as you know, I uphold that human principle, and so I've been asked to define what I mean as human multiple times, and of course I have to admit at some point I simply can't, that there's just some level of ambiguity that exists, not ambiguity, vagueness that exists within that term. But I also think it's one of those things that, despite not being definable, is also usable, right? Like we all sort of understand. Now it comes to these examples of like you mate this Neanderthal man with the professor of biology, and is are they kept in a cage or a cradle? I mean, common sense would say, the cradle because it's the offspring of the professor, but I think it just makes a more poignant point that there's like these in between stages where there's just moral confusion, moral gray. What are we supposed to do with those when you're not really sure what to call it?
Yeah, and I think that there are cases as well, like not just with something like if we had some early human who could possibly mate with another human and create some offspring, like um, I would think that that would be less of a gray area than it would be for other people if we were to compare that to a situation like um, there are some embryos, I believe in China. I've heard a bit about some tests being done where it's like is it a human and a pig embryo or like a human and a monkey being combined, something like that? And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I could imagine that people would be divided on what kind of thoughts people would have on that. Like, if someone believes in souls, would they think that something like this is an abomination that doesn't have a soul, or should this be given similar moral consideration to humans?
Mm-hmm. I think that's like a really tough question. It's definitely one of the ones that, challenges my position the hardest is to talk about these sort of gray areas. But then like the consequence of holding that position is to just say, well, then let's do away with the concept. Let's do away with these species human concepts, right? Just throw that all out the window and reduce it to suffering or, utilitarian principles and other principles. But for me, when I think about certain hypothetical scenarios and I can't apply any species scenario or species value to it, I it just goes so against my intuitions that I end up reverting back to that position of upholding the human value.
Okay. I think I'm following what you're saying, but I'm not sure what you mean. Are you saying that there are some gray case, or there are some scenarios that it's like a gray area that
Mm-hmm.
is difficult, that may be difficult to answer, but regardless of that, like you still do recognize that like you do hold humans as having like some sufficient amount of moral value.
So here's one of the hypotheticals that I've been working with recently that I feel like really strongly illustrates the point. Is to say, you are in the woods, you have a gun, you're a great marksman, and along in the woods you see a wolf chasing a deer, right? Um, if the wolf gets the deer, probably eat the deer alive. Not going to be a great death for the deer, but a wolf needs to eat. If the deer gets away, then the wolf goes hungry, and it's all good for the deer. Do you feel like in this situation you have any obligation to shoot the wolf, to shoot the deer, or do you think, you know, whatever plays out in nature, that's fine? It's not your job to shoot either one of them.
That's a great question. Um, Sorry, but I also realize I haven't answered your previous question of my thoughts on speciesism. Do you want to
No,
talk
no,
about this
that's
first,
okay.
and we could get
Just
back to
table
it?
it because this is I'm going to add on to this question after you answer this specific one.
Okay. Yeah. So you asked me if I think that there's an obligation, um, and as for obligations, right now in like I've been doing a bit of exploring of my moral system and some reading, and right now I'm not really sure what to think about obligations. So is it okay if I just answer in terms of what I think would be preferable, or what I think would be better
Yeah,
set
oh
up
yeah.
set
Like
up?
when I say obligations, I feel like they're like the sort of self-imposed duties. It's just like what you feel you need to do.
Okay. Um yeah, like I would think that in a situation like that, I know that some people and some vegans would say that we shouldn't impose in a situation in nature because it's necessary and there's no reason to impose in it. Um, but I don't know. I would think that my intuition is to say that if you can impose and you can make things better, and it would make no difference to you, then I don't see why it wouldn't be better to impose in a case like that. Because with so many other aspects of our lives, we're imposing on nature in so many other ways, just through habitat destruction, through resource use, and through all this, where we are affecting nature in negative ways. So if we can do something like guarantee that some kind of carnivorous animal is going to be able to not starve and another animal isn't going to have um, as violent and painful of a death,
Hmm.
then yeah,
So you're
I would think
thinking,
that that would be
are
preferable.
you leaning towards the shooting of the deer?
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Because remember, like if you don't shoot the deer has a chance to get away. It's not 100% going to get caught. So you are negating its even chance of survival.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I was answering assuming that we're saying that the deer would get caught, but if we're not sure if the deer would get caught or if it would get away in a situation like that,
Hmm.
I'm not sure what the best response or what the best response that a vegan would give to situations like that with dealing with carnivorous animals.
Sure.
I think I don't want to derail too much or go too much off topic, but maybe something like I've heard it suggested before that in situations like that, we should develop lab grown meat to give to carnivorous animals.
Well, I mean, in this hypothetical, you ain't got a lab grown meat station beside you. It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's really just making the call. But like I think, to say that it's gray, or I think a lot of people's intuitions would be, whatever happens, happens. It's not your responsibility to choose who lives or dies in this situation. Um, but then when I flip it is I say, imagine you see a wolf chasing a human, and you find out that human is a marginal case, right? Do you think when you see this and somebody beside you, they're using the same moral intuitions from the last case, and they go, nah, it's fine. He's a marginal case. Just don't worry about it.
Oh man, that's great. I like this a lot. You know what? And the funny thing is, my intuition here, like completely flips. That in the last case, I was saying kill the deer, but over
Mm.
here, I'm going. I still want to save the human intuitively. Yeah, yeah. So in the first case, like, do you think that most people would say? Do you think most people would be indifferent, or do you think more people would want to kill either the deer or the wolf?
Um, I think given that the deer has a chance to live and the wolf, there's like these gray areas. You kind of say, well, it's not our job to impose on nature who lives and dies. We're not even part of this scenario in a way. But when you see the human getting chased, you feel like you are a part of the scenario. You are involved in it. And I can't help but find that intuition very compelling to say that, in the second scenario, I just shoot the wolf. It's not a second thought. I just shoot the wolf, I save the person.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, in the second case with the human being chased, yeah, like I think that's my intuition. Like just naturally, I would gravitate towards that. I'd want to protect the human. Um, Sorry, there's something else I wanted to say, but I lost my train of thought. But this shooting the wolf, this makes me think of the Harambe example with the gorilla and the
Oh
kid that
yeah,
fell
yeah,
in.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
like
sorry.
it wasn't even like Harambe's fault or anything, but that animal still pays the price.
Uh-huh. But for the first case with the wolf chasing the deer, like I would think, yeah, maybe most people would be indifferent to that, but I would think if people were maybe if someone had a more stronger opinion on, maybe someone could hold a stronger opinion on that topic one way or another way if they were more well read on the topic of wild animal suffering. I'm
Mm,
certainly not, and I don't imagine that a lot of people are. But I think it'd be interesting to hear the thoughts of people who are read on that topic, what they would think and why they would think that.
sure, sure. To try and like equalize it. But from
Yeah.
where I stand, it just seems like the human principle just stands up on its own. And And so you're sort of left in this scenario where you look at scenarios like that and you say, well, okay, I definitely hold some sort of human-based value. And then you hit like the gray areas that we were talking about, which seems to challenge the fact that you ever did.
I'm sorry, I'm not following that.
Well, like the like when we start talking about like the gray areas of like what is even a human, what do you do in this scenario? You know, when you're talking about your half human, half pig, genetic examples, then it's just like it's hard to apply that concept, right? Because you don't really know how to treat these hybrid creatures. It's very confusing, and that's what challenges the human principle to begin with. It's what makes you say, well, get rid of it, get rid of it. Don't hold this human based value. And then you hit these other scenarios which obviously show that you do.
Uh-huh. So, I'm not sure if I'm understanding, but are you saying that you'd think that people generally, given a situation like this, that could be used to show that people do hold some kind of uh, preference to the human species over another species?
Yeah, yeah, with the hypothetical I was given, I think it does show that people do have that human sort of value. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
it's really weird when you hear people like, well, what is a species? What is a human? It's all vague. It's all vague. And then you throw that sort of scenario to them, and it's just like obvious that they're able to use the concept, even if they can't perfectly describe it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's interesting. I imagine um I wonder what take people would have on that, because I've spoken with some vegans who I've asked them about speciesism, like trying to get an understanding of speciesism, and I've had some different answers. I've had some people say that it means that um, it means that they don't discriminate based in virtue of species alone. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what that means. But I know some other vegans who they say that we should be anti-speciesist. We shouldn't make values based on species only. But they say that they admit that they do hold some anthropocentric values, and it's not a type of value that they would like to hold. But yeah, that reminds me of the article that you wrote about uh, being anti-speciesist and that running into some consequences um,
Mm,
that may not resonate with the average person who's hearing that. Like, if you choose to save the life of some other animal over the life of a baby human, like, would you be indifferent to that? And like in a situation like that, I think most people would say that they prefer the human. And I don't know if if that's a value that should be challenged, and if people eventually would not hold that value anymore if it were challenged, and if they thought about it or not. But yeah, to me right now, as it stands, like, I would, in almost any situation that I could imagine, I think that I would save the life of a human over the life of some other animal. But of course, you could give some hypothetical scenario where it would be better to save one over the other. But
sure.
in anything that I could imagine like happening in the real world, I would think that the human would almost always be preferable.
Now, do you think this is like just a product of our times? Do you think these views, would go the way of sexism, would go the way of racism? It's just something that, we have to get over.
Uh-huh, that's a really good question. Um, yeah, this makes me think of I saw you post a question on your Discord server somewhat recently um, about like if a human was raised by aliens. Could you say what that is, and then I could say something about that?
Yeah, I'll read it out. I can go quickly to it. I know what you're talking about.
Okay,
It
yeah,
was
because I had some thoughts on that that are similar that are related to this.
a human baby who has been abandoned by its mother is abducted and saved by aliens who secretly observe humans but generally don't interfere. This child is raised within the alien society until it becomes an adult. One day, the human finds itself in an odd predicament. It comes across a marginal case human with essentially the same capacities of an animal, and a marginal case alien with essentially the same capacities of an animal, who are going to die. This human can only save one of them. Is there a duty to save one over the other? If there's not a duty, do you suspect one would be chosen over the other? What motivates your answer?
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a great question. Yeah, so I don't know if there's a duty, so I don't know if I could answer that. But if I could say what I think, how I think people will react, I would think that people would generally, if they could only save one or the other, something of their own species or the species that has raised them,
Hmm.
I would think that they would have a greater preference towards the species that did raise them.
And
And what makes,
I think
sorry,
I'm
go ahead.
leaning. I no, yeah, I was gonna say I'm leaning on that direction too. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Like I think it's a reasonable guess to make, and what makes me say that is because of have you heard of feral children before?
Hmm.
Yeah, like if there's a kid who was like dumped into the forest and they were raised by wolves instead of humans, um, then that will have all kinds of effects on their cognition and like their ability to learn language when they're older, and stuff like that. And I would think that a person like this, that they would have like a greater preference, like kind of like seeing the wolves more as a tribe and more like themselves than other humans. So I would imagine in the case of the alien that it would be similar.
I do too, and I'm almost thinking that like this is sort of maybe one of the things you can say to say that it's disanalogous from racism and sexism is to say that you share a society with that sex, you share societies with that race. So to be racist and sexist against something you cohabitate with is different than upholding a value of something that you universally do share a society with.
Oh, I want to push you a little bit on that because this I'm not sure what you mean here. Because for example, someone could make the argument, maybe this isn't what you mean, but someone could make the argument that, for example, society before was just like just men or just a certain race of people were society, and the others like they weren't part of society in
Mm.
the same way. Like, what would you say in response to that?
Well, I think you certainly cohabitate with the opposite sex. I don't think that's ever different, but I think you could make that case on the race. I think that's a way to push back on that point. Is to say, obviously we were kind of segregated by these visible races that we've made up, and that if in that case we didn't really have an obligation to to find a way to cohabitate. Of course, like if we're talking about my own moral system, then I would lean towards the self awareness principle in order to divide that. But then, if you wanted to push back against that, you can just say, well, what if it was a marginal case? Um, you have only Europeans and they come across an entire race of humans that are all marginal cases. Do they have an obligation to take care of them? Given that they never cohabitated and that there is no self awareness principle to lean on. Um, I'm not sure where I would end up going with that because, like, I mean, given that I'm a product of my time, I'm going to be like, well, of course we should take care of them. But is that just because, the culture that I've been raised in, that I already have these preconceptions?
Uh-huh. So sorry, let me go back to the question that you asked then. So like things like racism, sexism, like we think that those are obviously wrong. I think we could both agree on that.
Hmm.
But with the issue of speciesism, with speciesism on the table right now, like that's something I don't know, maybe I'm just not on board because I'm not really understanding it. But do you think that if our society moves more and more in the direction of veganism, do you think that if that were the case, that we would adopt more anti-speciesist values, possibly?
Maybe because I mean, certainly of people that I speak to, the vegans are more willing to be anti-speciesist, but a lot of the time, like you're saying, that there's a lot of gaslighting too, right? Where vegans will say, "Of course, I'm anti-speciesist. Species is never relevant," and then you hit them with those certain hypotheticals, and then you realize that they are. Um,
Uh-huh.
um, one thing that I think we would both agree on, maybe, is that there's nothing incompatible about being a vegan and speciesist, right? Like to say that you would choose a human over another animal doesn't preclude you from also saying, I don't think we should kill and farm or eat any of them anyways.
Yeah, 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 definitely. Yeah, if that's what you mean by vegan, then 100%. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So you're really only like using this sort of speciesist principle in these choose one scenarios. And other than that, it doesn't really affect you.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, but I still think that like if if the vegan concedes to these choose one scenarios, they legitimize that particular value, right? This human centered value. And then some non vegan comes along and says, well, I have a different application for it. That's one less thing the vegan can say to the non-vegan is to say that, well, that's an arbitrary value, or these sorts of replies. If you can point out that they also use it just in different situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like yeah, so it really depends on what exactly we mean by speciesism. Like so far, it seems like when we've been talking about speciesism, we've been saying, is there value like to just sorry, let me say that again. Is there value in virtue of just the species? And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but maybe speciesism could be used in another sense of saying that, or I don't know if speciesism would be used in this sense. I guess I'd have to read more about speciesism, but maybe by speciesism, what they someone could be using that word to mean that there isn't some significant difference between species that um, justifies a significant difference in moral value that is sufficient for some kind of different treatment.
Hmm. Well, what is your thoughts on it? Like, where do you end up leaning?
On which definition of speciesism?
Either one of them. Like, do you think you hold any form of like? Well, I mean, we can just change it to like human-based values. Just whatever your concept of human is. Do you think you would hold one? Do you think we should be getting rid of them?
Let me think about that. There are definitely yeah, like if I'm thinking if I had to if I had a choice like between one or the other, like would I choose the human? Would I always choose the human? I'm thinking there are definitely specific humans that I do value very much, but I'm sure there are also people with pets that like they would value their pet a lot. Like I imagine there are some people that would say that like they'd save their pet dog over another human.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, like if I were just to think, if I was just given like limited information or in almost any situation, like I think that if I had to choose to save the life of a human or some other animal, I think that I would very generally lean towards the case of the human.
For sure. And do you think that's something you should get rid of? Is that something you should be getting over?
I really don't know. I haven't heard a good argument for why that should be the case, but I haven't very much looked into arguments for that. So I'm open to being persuaded about that. But right now, yeah, I don't have a very strong stance on.
Okay. I feel like I'm leaning more and more towards the honoring your connections philosophy. You know, rather than it's human, it's just the you have connections to human and you should be honoring that.
Kind of like what you were raised by, like you would want to protect that.
Yeah, yeah. Which is like I guess this is somewhat of like a virtue ethicist point, right? It's like what is the character of a person who doesn't give a shit about the things that they were raised by and raised around? Like how did you become so detached? But then, you know, when it comes to things that you're not raised around, it's like there would be no expectation. Like why should you have developed that value?
I'd have to think about that. Yeah, that's some good food for thought.
Ooh, he said it. Okay, we can move on to the next question, which
Okay.
was why is it so hard to define what a vegan is?
Oh, that's a very good question. I love this question. I think this is my favorite question. Um, yeah, it's very difficult to define it. I think because it depends on what context the word is going to be used on. I think it's uh, particularly difficult to define what is meant by vegan if someone wants to define vegan such that they can say that something is moral if it's vegan, something is immoral if it is not vegan,
Mm-hmm.
and that is just universally always the case. I think that's a really difficult situation to define um, what's meant by vegan, and I don't really think there's any need to define veganism that way, um, because and I'm imagining like part of the reason that someone would want to define veganism in that way would be because if someone says, let's say someone says, "Oh, veganism is just not eating any animal products, not buying anything that
Uh-huh.
exploited animals, whatever exploitation means." And then someone says, "Well, what if you were on a deserted island and all you could do was just kill a pig and you couldn't eat the food that the pig was eating?" And then I think a lot of vegans in that situation would say, "Well, look, it's a survival situation, so in
Uh-huh.
that case, it would be vegan to do." So it's like you it's difficult to define veganism in that way and saying that look, veganism is always moral because then you end up with these situations like this um, where people are trying to like poke holes into your definition and you're just always trying to patch up these holes and say, oh look, well that loophole, well that's actually caught into my definition, and then you're just creating like more and more complex rules to account for these specific examples of things that are ethical and you would want to fall under the definition of veganism, but which may have not initially been considered in the definition of veganism. So I think if someone, so just to summarize that part that I just said, so if someone is trying to define veganism as something that always is moral and whatever is non-vegan is always immoral, then you just end up making a really complex definition that has to account for a lot of exceptions.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's also the flip side of you know, most vegans want it to be an ethical position, so you don't want to say that just because someone's currently abstaining um, from meat or animal products, but it's just a happenstance, and they don't actually really care about animals or are interested in animal rights. You probably wouldn't say that they're a vegan.
Yeah, that's another great point. Yeah, so that yeah, you're right that there is the both sides that it's like if you're trying to specifically define if you're trying to specifically define veganism as a moral position, then you run into the issue of having to account for all these things that are potentially exceptions. But on the other hand, there are people who they want to specify that it is a moral position, that it is as far as is possible and practicable, right? Because and in a situation like that, like you end up having some, you could have some vagueness in the definition.
Hmm.
um, and what I don't like about that is that well, I guess in some cases it's an issue. Someone could say, well, look, like if I have like a quarter pound of beef like once a year, is that vegan? Like, what if I couldn't be quote unquote vegan otherwise? If I didn't have that, otherwise I'd be a full blown meat eater. If that wasn't the case, like this I need at least a little bit for it to be possible and practicable for me.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, there's one other thing. Let me see if I could catch my train of thought. Yeah. So you were saying that there's also so there's the issue of defining veganism, of trying to not have trying to not get like moral language caught up in it, or trying to keep the moral language in it. And in the second case, in the example that you brought up, I think part of the motivation behind that may be part of the motivation behind making this distinction between veganism and between being a vegan and being plant based
Hmm.
uh, can be kind of such that like I've talked about this before, kind of like, what is it called, like making a no true Scotsman fallacy
Oh, is
of
that what you think
being,
it is?
well, it can, that might be part of the motivation in some specific cases for rationalizing why a vegan would no longer be vegan. Because in that specific case, you could say, well, look, they were never vegan; they were plant based. When sure, in a lot of cases, we could even grant that in a lot of cases that may be true, but there may be some specific people. Like, it's not impossible that someone did adopt vegan values and lived a vegan lifestyle, and then upon reflection or upon um, running into health issues, possibly,
Hmm.
they realize that, or that they no longer want to do this. So I think that it is possible that someone could have been vegan and is no longer vegan. um, so yeah, I don't think I do think there is such a thing as ex-vegans, or at least there could potentially be.
So would you agree then that whatever a vegan is, it has to adopt, at least for the time being of when they're a vegan, a particular attitude. It's not just like a set of behaviors.
Yeah, that's a good question. The way that I use the word veganism, well, to answer your question, I'd say not necessarily. Like, I don't the way that I try to use the word vegan, like, it's dependent on who I'm speaking with. Just whatever way they use the word vegan, like, I'll just adapt in that situation to use vegan the way that they mean it, or whatever. Like, I don't think there's like any true value like objectively to the word vegan. Like it just means what it means based on what the majority of people accepts. Like, if the
Sure.
majority of people think that it has some moral connotation, then it does. If vegan just means like no eating meat, dairy, eggs, maybe honey, and then not buying fur, leather, whatever, and
Well,
there's no moral connotation.
just to clarify, because I have opinions on this too. Do you think it's the majority of people or the majority of people who self-label that define the concept?
Oh, that's a very good question. I hadn't thought of that.
I
I would
I,
think
I
that
tend to
maybe.
lean to the latter.
Sorry, was the latter the people who self-identify as that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable position. Yeah, I think I'd lean towards that too.
Like I try to figure out what the majority of vegans who call themselves vegans are doing in order to understand what a vegan is. That's sort of been, the way I go about it. Because if you go with the majority of people, you might end up thinking, vegans defined as hippie tree lovers who are kind of pussies and, this and that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 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 and I could imagine that being an issue with other cases too. Like, if like if there's some specific group of people that they identify in some certain way, but the people who aren't part of that group are much larger and they have a different definition of that, then that group probably wouldn't want to be defined in some different way. So yeah, that's something important to think about. I think you're right about that.
Do you think the vegan society definition, the possible and practical, could ever be upheld?
Um, I think, well, it all depends on what possible and practicable means, right? Like someone could be a meat eater and say that, well, this is as possible and practicable as I can be. So we could say that like anybody is living up to that standard depending on how they define it and how they interpret.
Sure, but when you take a word like possible, and I hear this word, I'm thinking like you're saying that you have to do anything logically possible. If it can be done, you have to do it. And then
Uh,
practicable is a weird one because that means more like you just have to be able to practice it day in and day out.
yeah, exactly. So like I like if by possible like they just mean like logically possible, meaning that it's not logically impossible, then I think that is it's almost like redundant to put that word in there because it's like you're not going to do something impossible anyways. Like that's basically
Yeah,
just
of
a
course.
tautology. You can't do anything impossible. um so if that's what's meant by it, then we could just take out that part of the sentence and then we could just say as far as is practicable. And like as far as is practicable, like I take that to mean that the individual is doing as much as they can. And I think like
But
one
are
response.
who does that? Who does as much as they can?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, where it's like, are you a negative utilitarian? Are you trying to go as possible? And some people are, to be fair, but where like I've met vegans who like say that like they don't that they feel guilty for like eating plants and the harm that comes from that, and they're like, yeah, I have trouble like justifying continuing my existence, and like that's kind of sad to hear. Like I don't want,
Mm.
I don't know, it makes me sad to hear that like people feel that way because I think that like they deserve to have a good life. They deserve to be happy. And it's like if
Yeah, but that's so hard too when you say, I think you deserve to be happy, go ahead and do this and that. And then, you reflect and realize the cost that it has to something else that you said, also has the right to be happy. It's like, well,
yeah,
what do you do with that?
yeah, no, it's definitely a tough situation. Like for me personally, and I know not everybody is going to hold this value, and I know some vegans who don't hold this value. I don't know if it's some vegans or the majority of vegans, but I think that it's okay to cause some amount of harm to be able to keep living just in your day to day life, because we are going to be causing harm in our day to day life, in our daily actions. Like we have to be okay with some amount of that. We have to be able to accept that if we want to continue living, we can try to reduce that. We can try to encourage others to reduce it, or we could take measures to try to reduce this if that's valuable to us. But
And
yeah,
it's
I think that we do have to accept that that is the case.
and it's hard not to get pushed to just pure antinatalism if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like that would like anti-natalism or like ethylism would follow from negative utilitarianism, possibly.
And I find it kind of funny because like when it comes to this possible and practical definition, I had this funny interaction on Reddit recently where this
Oh
guy was
boy.
just defending that he does everything, literally everything possible to reduce
uh,
suffering. And I'm sitting here thinking this guy is spending time on the internet
uh,
debating me on Reddit while telling me he does everything possible.
well, maybe he's thinking that he'll convince you, and then you'll be able to convince others, and it'll like snowball effect.
Well, he's not even being nice about it. He's just coming at me.
Uh,
It's just
well,
like
that's the approach that'll reduce suffering the most. You got to give tough love.
maybe he works it out in his mind like that. But on my perspective, I'm just rolling my eyes.
Oh,
It's just no way you do everything possible. It's like, what about just like watching TV and playing games and movies? It's like, even if you made the argument, well, I need to be entertained. Well, it's like, your entertainment requires electricity. Like, people were doing things before that. Why don't you go learn to juggle, or just, get off the internet, stop making pollution while you're entertained? Do you really need these sorts of things? And and I mean, that's not me moralizing and telling people not to do it, but like, if you're really going to defend the principle that you do everything possible and practicable while while watching Breaking Bad, I just can't agree that that's what you're doing.
yeah, we all have to move to the woods and live off grid like freely.
Well, I mean, I think there's some level of, electricity usage, and some level of that's defendable. It seems reasonably defendable. But then certain amounts of it, you got to say, it's just luxury, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like it makes me think back to you had a chat with someone at a Cube of Truth. You have a video of that on your channel.
Mm,
And like you're asking this guy, like he was putting forward some views that are almost like negative utilitarian, where you were saying, um, he was saying like, yeah, well, look, like this reduces suffering, and you're like, okay, do we always have to reduce suffering? Like, is it okay to have some kind of luxury in our life? And he's like, well, look, like this is easy to do, and you're like, well, do we have to do something just because it's easy?
yeah, no, I was giving that guy a hard time for sure.
Yeah, yeah. But I wanted to say one more thing on the definition of veganism from the Vegan Society, because like so far we've mostly been taking a consequential attitude towards this, but there are of course like
Uh huh.
virtue ethicist vegans and like deontological vegans, where like they'd have a completely I don't know about completely different stance, but yeah, they'd have like different reasons for adopting this same lifestyle. Like they would think like um, these animals have a right, it is wrong to exploit them.
Uh huh. No, I do think those sorts of definitions are more defendable. But what's interesting is that you're gonna have a lot of vegans who go off the vegan society definition. They're gonna espouse that that's what they are. That's what it means to be a vegan. And you have to turn around and tell all these people who are self-labeling, look, no, it's not, because you're not doing this.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it's good for people to question and challenge that.
I had my own definition. Have you heard the definition I wrote for vegan?
I honestly don't remember it. I'm not sure if I have seen it. What is it?
I'll read this. It's veganism is a way of life that seeks to place the value of animal life, health, liberty above the value of substitutable classes of goods, services, and uses derived from animals.
Okay, sorry, could you read that one more time? I just want to hear
Yeah,
that again.
veganism is a way of life that seeks to place the value of animal life, health, and liberty above the value of substitutable classes of goods, services, and uses derived from animals.
Oh, I like that. I can imagine some people though. I can imagine some people though, when they first hear that, they may not be very on board with part of it, especially with the part of saying, sorry, what was the wording that you use for saying it? It almost sounds like implicitly you're saying that like one has more value. Sorry, what was the wording?
Yeah, I'm saying you place the value of animal life, health, and liberty above the value of substitutable classes of goods, services, and uses derived from animals.
Yeah, yeah, saying that the value of one is above the value of the other. Like I can imagine some people, even though this isn't necessarily being said, but I can imagine that some people would interpret that to say like, why are you considering the value of plants? Like plants don't feel pain. I don't know if you've ever gotten responses like that to that definition, but yeah,
No,
I think
no.
that's a
Well, yeah. Like, if somebody wants but that's like counter argument that's used against any vegan definition, is to talk about plant sentience.
Uh-huh.
But the
Let
idea
me
here is
think.
just to say that, animals are worth more than the things that we derive from them if it's substitutable, right? So I think that what my definition leaves open is the possibility of things like medical testing that it's like, well, there's no substitute to this. Um, or your desert island scenarios, there's nothing to substitute with, so you have to do it, right? So it leaves open like being vegan in these scenarios.
Yeah, yeah, and this is pretty funny. Like, this is if not my favorite, then one of my favorite definitions of veganism, and it's written by a non-vegan. So that's got to be saying something. Um,
Oh, I hope I've
but
been around in the conversation well enough to not be shitting the bed on this sort of thing.
yeah, 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 yeah. Being able to define what you're arguing against, that's good, I think. It reminds me of something Warren Buffett said. Like I've been reading a bit of Warren Buffett stuff recently, and he was saying that the way in which you should act is such that imagine your actions are going to be written about on the front page of a newspaper by an unfriendly but intelligent reporter.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And there's something else I think I wanted to say about your definition of veganism. Yeah, I think I've lost my train of thought though. Is there something else you wanted to say about the definition of veganism or this topic?
Well, I guess I could ask you is like, do you think most vegans who self-label are vegans just they think they're consequentialists, they think they're pure utilitarians, but they're not? Do you agree with that?
Do I think that most vegans think that they're consequentialists or utilitarians, but they're not?
Yeah,
I really don't know. Let me think if like just intuitively if I have any thoughts on that. Because like it's an empirical question and
sure.
we don't have access to that data. Um,
Best you can do is, give your overall impression, but it might not be right.
yeah. Um, I really don't know because I imagine early on, like in the first uh, around the birth of the animal rights movement, around that time when people were, when like university professors and whatever were getting involved in the animal rights movement. Around that time, when it first started, I would guess that there would be more of a focus on animal rights. So I would guess that people were more deontological at that time, because there is a big focus on animals in factory farms and also on animal experimentation. Um, and like you
Mm-hmm.
should have a chat with Nick Lyson about this sometime. I'd love to hear you guys talk about this. Um,
I'm
but
always down to talk to Nick.
yeah, he's a really nice guy. Um, and Yeah, so I imagine initially at first people I would have imagined that initially vegans would have been more deontological. But if that's still the case or if the opposite case is true now, I honestly wouldn't know. I wouldn't know how to guess that.
I'm gonna come out and be cheeky, but
Okay.
I think most the reason that people use the possible and practical definition is because it sounds nice. Like it's literally just gaslighting. It's just
Oh,
like this is. I think I'm doing everything I can humanly possibly do, and it just sounds so nice to be able to say that about yourself.
well, but like you could use that definition too, even if you don't follow a pure plant-based diet. You could go, look, I'm doing whatever's possible for me.
Yeah. No, yeah, for sure. And then it just becomes a pointless definition, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to like the next one, which is somewhat related. So I had a series of three statements I wrote here. It is accepted that people can do things beyond just survival and basic needs. Some of those activities have a cost to animals. There must be an account within veganism that allows for this.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I read this. Um and I myself I put it into modus ponens in my head. Um
Okay.
yeah, I think this kind of represents the same point. Hold on, let me make sure I'm getting this right. So it was like if P and Q then R, P and Q therefore R. So it's like if um, a vegan's action causes some amount of harm to animals, um, and vegans want to reduce, um, sorry, let me say that again. If vegans, if a vegan's action results in some amount of harm to animals and a vegan wants to minimize harm to animals, then there must be some justification for that action. And then we just affirm the antecedent. And then the conclusion is that there has to be some difference between like consuming animal products, which causes harm to animals, and some action that also harms animals that we find justifiable. Is that the idea that you're getting across?
Yeah, yeah, sort of. So it's like where in veganism is the account for being allowed to watch movies? Where is for being
Uh,
able to destroy some land and build some new buildings, over top of some old animal homes? Like,
uh-huh.
why does it stop at eating animals and products, but not for the other things that cause damage to animals that are also not based off of your survival?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like this question a lot. So it's basically like, why do we draw the line where we do for what we consider to be vegan, right?
Hmm. And yeah, it's related to the previous point.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's a very good question.
Like,
I've
what
tried.
principle can you say that says, yeah, no, totally building a movie, like knocking over this bird's house to put a movie theater down is totally cool. Just don't put a burger in your mouth.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, a couple of things to say about that. Like, I've spoken to a couple of vegans about this. Um, the poorer answers that you'll get is just like people telling you going back to the definition of vegan and saying like, well, look, it's as far as possible and practicable. I'm just doing whatever is reasonable. Like that's I think an answer that you've gotten when you were speaking to someone at the Cube of Truth.
Uh huh.
Um, and yeah, that doesn't establish what principle uh, leads to what actions are or are not immoral or where we draw the line. Um, and I think the answer then is going to vary depending on the person's moral system. Like if someone is a consequentialist, um, then I guess they would just have to say that at this point, the moral value that this passes a sufficient threshold at which the action is immoral, but in the other case, it isn't the case. And how does someone perform this calculation for determining that in one case it is justifiable and in another it isn't? I don't know. Like
Uh
it's
huh.
a consequentialist attitude, so it just seems like it's necessarily post hoc, where it's like after the fact you're giving an account for if you think that it is or isn't moral. But
And
if
and
someone,
and I want to push on that because it's like, what do you think would happen if they did in fact give you some metrics upon which you could do these calculations? You end up doing them, and it turns out you can't build that movie theater, but you can eat the burger.
yeah,
It's like, what are they going to do? Are they actually going to switch actions? I doubt it.
yeah, no, I'd agree with you. Yeah, if someone does give some, it depends on the person. I don't think that everyone necessarily would have that attitude. I think if someone very much likes the idea of what they consider to be vegan and they're very attached to that idea and they want to defend this notion or this some kind of specific definition of veganism, then I think that they could just keep adjusting their calculation for any situation you give them that gives them an unfavorable answer. But I think some people who, if they say, no, this calculation does reflect my values very well. So for me, this person might say, for me, what I deem to be ethical is based on my moral judgment, not necessarily what other people would label as vegan or not vegan. So I think it depends on the person in that case.
No, that's fair. But so let's get away from the utilitarianism. Do you think, like, have you heard of a convincing account for the differences here?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
For like why we can't eat the food and why we can't um use leather or whatever, but we can demolish the homes of animals to make new buildings. We can expend electricity to pollute the environment.
Uh-huh, that's a very good question. So you're saying, why why are we saying that something like having a hamburger once in a while is wrong, but using electricity and developing land is that we're okay with one case but not the other?
Hmm.
Well, I guess just because one case is reasonable, the other is. um, but
But that doesn't tell me what the reason was. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just making a joke.
yeah.
Um, um, yeah, like if we're saying, is there some specific principle that can account for that? Um, I guess it'd have to I guess it'd depend on the person's moral system, right? Like we were just talking about how the consequentialist would account for that, but there's also like how would a virtue ethicist respond to that, or how would someone who's a deontologist respond to that? Like they could think that and I'm like virtue ethics is probably like what I'm uh, least read on, so I can't give a good answer for that at all.
Uh-huh.
Um, but for the case of for the case of deontology, um, I'm trying to think like if what kind of principles could someone adopt where one case would be okay and one wouldn't be okay. I guess they'd say that no, I'd have to give this some more thought to be able to give a good answer on that, because if we're talking specifically about universal principles, whether those principles are absolute and the principle itself tells you whether the action is right or wrong, or
Hmm.
whether the principles are contributory and we're saying we weigh all of the principles and determine overall if an action is right or wrong. Um, yeah, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know what principles exactly should be given in that case. If we're talking about some principles that are like generally upheld, that are generally true, um, then yeah, I imagine like a deontologist could make some arguments there. But to answer your question for what principles it would be, what principles specifically would distinguish between one case and the other case? Off the top of my head right now, I can't think of what principles specifically would distinguish between those two cases, whether it's for a deontologist or a virtue ethicist.
Yeah, and I'm usually interested in steel manning positions, but I can't find anything that I think sounds reasonable in these sorts
Well,
of.
okay, I'll have to read more into it then, or talk to someone
There is
smarter
the
than me and
argument
get you an answer.
of entailment, which I think is like one of the ones you can sort of lean on, which is to say that entailed within the animal within the act of eating meat is killing an animal. Like there is no logically possible way to remove this. But in the in the example of polluting, that there is no entailment that using electricity must kill, the animals, right? Or but it's also just like it just seems to be ignoring reality. That's my problem with it.
Um, Sorry, I want to say something on this, but what do you mean by it's ignoring reality? Oh, I think I know what you mean, but could you explain?
It's just like pollution will end up killing animals. Just the fact that it's not entailed in it, it's still just going to happen. And like, so is displacing homes. It's like, yeah, there's a logical possible way to make a building without displacing animal homes, but you're doing it. So like, why are we leaning on entailment as a
Yeah,
principle?
exactly. And it's like the same issue if you try to make that argument for like crop deaths or using pesticides, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, what I wanted to say about that, yeah, I have heard that case being made before. Um, but the one issue that I take with it is this. And like if we were like 10 years into the past, then I don't know if we'd be able to make this argument. But as we move along, like this is just going to become more and more true. Um, like the possibility of lab grown meat is developing, right?
Hmm.
So it's we're eventually going to be at the point where we can say no, it isn't necessarily entailed that an animal will die from the
Yeah.
production of lab grown meat if it gets to the point where like we don't need fetal bovine serum for producing cells and we could just endlessly create meat cells without killing any further animals.
And it would be such a, I had no vegan I think would accept to be able, the argument is like, well, because it's not entailed that eating meat kills animals, I can kill animals right now to eat meat.
Yeah, yeah, I don't think a vegan would accept that.
Yeah. But that sort of logic is used to defend some of the activities within veganism from some people, not all people, but some people sort of use that entailment argument. But I don't see how it's any different than the lab grown meat example.
Uh-huh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'd have to give that some thought to see like, but yeah, right now my thoughts are that that's my issue with it.
Okay, I'm gonna go up to the next question.
Okay.
What is the scale of sentience and how is it conceptualized?
Oh boy, I have no idea.
So, so
What?
do you uphold this idea that like there is a continuum of sentience and like things on the lower end of it are less valuable and things on the higher end are more valuable, and it's just one big scale?
Um, Sorry, let me make sure I understand. Like, could you give me some examples of things that people who hold this view would consider like more sentient or less sentient, and what that would entail?
Well, okay, so some people would point at, well, what's the lowest thing? Like a gnat, and then they'd be like a squirrel, and then a dog, and then a dolphin, and then a human, and then some advanced alien, and then some super AI, and they would say that moral value sits on this chart. Like you can go from less to more.
Uh-huh. So is the question if I think that it is the case that there is some difference in sentience between different organisms, or if I think that they should be valued differently in virtue of that difference?
Both.
Um, okay, yeah, so let's answer the first one then. So do I think that there is some difference in sentience between um, different organisms. Oh boy, I feel like I'm not qualified at all to talk about this. I know nothing about neuroscience. But yeah, so as someone who's like a complete layperson on this topic, um,
Well, have you seen this position being espoused?
um, I might have seen it before, but I've never really heard it explained. I don't really know about this. I know some vegans. I know some people specifically who are opposed to the idea, but I'm not really too familiar with the idea itself. Like I'm trying to think, like what exactly would it mean that something is more sentient than something else? Like, does that just mean that it has more uh, complex cognitive capacities, and that does it mean that it can experience like more well-being or a more fulfilling life, or it could potentially have a better life? Like I'm not sure what is necessarily entailed in this view.
And that's one of the things I wanted to bring up. But I was just curious because there's certain people within the movement. Um, I'm not going to bring up, but they do hold this view that um, when it comes to like why they would choose the human over the other or this or that it's like, well, because some are more sentient than others. And this often comes down to some people's defense of like, why don't you kill yourself rather than spray pesticides, right? And it's like, well, I'm a more sentient being, right? So my value supersedes the value of those insects.
Uh-huh. Um, I guess it depends on what is meant by sentience. Like it depends on what's meant by sentience. If I'd accept that view or not. But it essentially boils down to, at least my understanding. Oh, sorry, I listened to a debate that you had the other day. Or sorry, the other day I listened to a debate that you had where the word boils down was used. But I think I'm using the word boils down. Okay. I sorry. Let me just think. What was I saying? Yeah. So if we say that um, one being is more sentient than another, therefore I value it more,
Uh-huh.
then essentially that boils down to I am choosing one over the other because one is more valuable than the other. So it's like, yeah, like I'm going to make the same conclusion. I'm going to say that one is more valuable than the other, but I don't necessarily know if it's in virtue of the same thing. Is it in virtue of it being a specific species? Is it in virtue of its sentience, or is it in virtue of some other combination of things that are true of one but not true of the other?
And so going on the point of like, what does it even mean to be on this scale? Um, I wrote this question: is it in terms of quantity or quality? And to expand on that point, it's like when we talk about like the capacity to suffer or the capacity to have more well-being, it's like those things that can suffer more are more valuable, and those things that could experience more well-being are more valuable, or something like that. And to me, it gets to these weird conclusions where it's like you look at a whale, right? And how many nerve endings does this thing have? It's just massive. Um,
Uh huh.
it has a bigger brain than people, not in terms of to body size, but in terms of overall volume. Um, and most people's intuitive answer is that no, it's not more sentient, right? Despite the fact that like if I went with like certain metrics like how many nerve endings or how big are your eyes for your perception, or these sorts of metrics, it's like that doesn't seem to be what anybody cares about when they're talking about sentience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that makes me think of a book. This is a great book. You'd like this book a lot if you haven't read it before. I can't remember the name of the author, but they've done a lot of work on like testing the cognitive capacities of animals. And it's like a history of the last few generations of research in that specific field. The book is called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?"
I've
Um,
heard of that.
yeah, yeah, it's really good. I'd recommend it. Um, yeah, and a big part of it is when we perform a test on an animal and we come to the conclusion that this animal isn't intelligent, very often that could be the case that it's our own ego that we don't want to know that some other animal is intelligent. So
Mm,
like the research that we're performing ourselves could be a bit biased because we're just looking for that conclusion. And in a lot of cases where we design a test that's meant to measure how smart an animal is, um, and we get the result that an animal isn't smart, very often that's because of the specific design of the study. Like there's this one, as an example, like there's this one specific type of, um, I can't remember if it was a monkey or an ape, and they designed this one test where they would put some food that this monkey or ape would really like just outside of the reach just outside of how far that it could reach with its hand,
Hmm.
and they would put some tools. They would scatter tools that like sticks or whatever that it could pick up and it could use to bring the food towards it. And for a long time, these animals they always failed this test, and researchers had just always thought that for whatever reason, like this, I'm pretty sure it was an ape. Like this ape was always thought to be like the dumbest apes. They're like, why are all these other apes so smart? They could do stuff so much more complicated than this, but these apes here, like this is such a simple thing, but they can't figure it out. Um, and they realized it's because of the way that the test was done that these monkeys, um, they're like their attention isn't normally focused on the ground. Like their attention is usually focused upwards because they're looking at around at climbing and what kinds of things are above them. So if they just adjusted the test to have the tools and the foods in areas that the ape was aware of, then it succeeds in this test, obviously. And there are all kinds of cases like this with animals where we're trying to test their intelligence in a way that isn't conducive to having good results. And if the test was just altered slightly, then they could pass these tests with flying colors.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. Do you think like when people talk about the scales of sentience that they are just talking about intelligence?
Hmm. Um, I'm not too familiar with the topic, but I would guess no. I would think there's more to sentience than just intelligence.
I,
Like my
yeah.
interpretation of sentience. Yeah, like I don't know. I don't know exactly what's entailed by it, but I would imagine more than sentience. Like what you could possibly experience maybe as part of it.
Yeah, but is that in terms of quality or quantity? It's like if something can experience higher levels of pain or brighter colors, or is that what we're looking for? Or are we looking for like specific qualities to those experiences?
Uh-huh. Sorry, I'm not really understanding the distinction. Could you give me another example of the distinction?
Well, let's say that there's like, okay, so a very simple way of saying this is to say that there's one being that can only smell, right? But its smell is stronger than anything that you can imagine. And then there's
Okay.
another being that has five senses. Which one's more sentient? Even if all five senses were dull.
Okay, okay. I think I'm following then. That's really interesting. Um, yeah, okay. So I think my guess would be and yeah, this is just a guess because I haven't used this sentience hierarchy. I would guess when someone's speaking of this sentience hierarchy, I would think I would think it's based on I don't know actually. I want to say that it would be based on like capacity to experience well-being and suffering. Um, but I don't know that
Mhm.
maybe that's different
But if yeah, the
from
problem
sentience.
the problem with that view is if you say it's just well-being and suffering, then on what grounds do we ever say humans are more sentient than another? It's like I would agree that we have more complex ways of going about well-being and suffering, but do we have more of it? Like what about the whale with its just billions more nerve endings than us? Couldn't it experience suffering to a higher degree than us?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Even if it's not complex, right?
Sorry, are you asking do we know if one human is more sentient than another human or if a human is more sentient than another animal
Yeah,
or vice
well,
versa?
most of the people who use these scales always put, humans at the top of the animal kingdom, and I'm like, I think that might be questionable. Like, let's even if we say, like, we think that there's, like, an emotional well-being, like the feeling of happiness and whatever, and, you take this down to a material route and you look, okay, this chemical is, happiness, right? Then you go find out that in the whale's brain, it just pumps out, three times the amount of this for doing simple tasks. When it eats some fish or goes swimming, it has three times more of this chemical than you do. It's like, are we then going to say this whale is more valuable than us?
Uh-huh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and if someone holds a consequentialist view, then if something like that turns out to be the case, then we could find that like whales are utilitarian monsters, maybe, where like their well-being, like causing human suffering, would justify whale well-being, possibly.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm not sure what exactly is used to. Yeah, I'm not sure what method is used to measure sentience in the sentience scale, or exactly what it means. Yeah, so I don't know.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'll go to the other question then because if you don't really hold that view or are not aware of it, there's only so much we can talk about it. But
Yeah, yeah.
so my next question was, do vegans lean too hard on practical argumentation to make principled points? And and this is gonna sort of put the anonymous for voiceless Joey Carb Strong people on blast. Um,
Uh,
and this is one of my critiques, is that a lot of the time the vegan conclusion should be, it's wrong to kill and eat animals for food. So it's like this very simple basic point. But when I say they lean too hard on practical argumentation, is they show the Dominion footage, they show the Earthlings footage to try and establish this principal point that doesn't necessarily follow.
sorry. So, okay, okay, I'm following. But sorry, what's the question? What exactly is the question?
Do vegans lean too hard on practical argumentation to make principled points?
Hmm.
So
Um.
I can give like an example of this is like, let's say that Joey Carbstrong asks someone, is there a humane way to kill an animal? Right?
Okay.
And they reply, I think there is. And then Joey brings up his laptop showing Dominion footage and says, do you think this is humane?
Okay.
Do you think he's like even addressing the question?
Uh. Um. Yeah. Okay. So in a specific case like that, hold on. Let me go through that again. Okay. So, Joey asks, "Do you think that there is a humane way to kill an animal?" The person says yes, and he shows them a specific example of an animal being killed and asks them, "Do you think is humane? Do you think this is humane?"
Yeah.
Um, it it's not necessarily addressing the question, but it could be, because let's say that there is a person who thinks that um, let's say there is a person who thinks that the way that animals are being slaughtered right now is generally humane, like whatever standard practice is. Like, let's say someone is
Uh-huh.
not familiar with what standard practice is, but they think that it is appropriate, whatever it is. And if they're showed something that is standard practice, and someone like Joey says, "Well, look, this is how animals are regularly killed," um, then in that specific case, I would think that, yeah, that would be addressing that. But if we were to have a case of, if somebody thinks, no, the way that animals are killed now is wrong, I think there is a way to do it that is okay. I think all animals should be in slaughterhouses instead of the way that we do it now. I think slitting their throats and having them bleed out. I think that's inhumane. That's too gruesome for me. I think it'd be better if they all just had their heads blown off with shotguns. I would think that would be more humane
Mm.
than showing a specific example that doesn't address what the person thinks is humane. Then in a case like that, it wouldn't necessarily be um, addressing that point.
Yeah, and that's just one of my criticisms when I'm watching the Earthling ads, the Joey Carbstrongs, the anonymous for voiceless footage, is that's sort of their limitation in their argumentation, is it's always to show them the footage, to show them, like, look at the way we're doing it wrong now, in order to make the point that it is always wrong. And I just feel like there's this leap that can't be made through that method. Like, you actually have to discuss the principles underlying it.
Uh-huh. I see the point that you're making. Um, but if we could just go one level below that before we address this issue, like I would think that if we're talking about efficacy, in convincing people and getting people to consider this idea or to think about whether this is a moral issue.
Uh-huh.
I think appealing to people's emotions in this specific case is a better way to get people to consider it or even to get people on board than using a purely rational and logical approach. Now, whether we're saying that like you should come to some final conclusion based on some principle that every single case is wrong, if someone's trying to establish that principle from showing one specific case of how things are wrong right now,
Hmm.
yeah, I'd agree that that doesn't necessarily follow. But yeah, if we're talking about the efficacy in getting people to consider this, then I think that having visual footage can be a good element of that strategy if done properly.
I mean, I tend to agree. I tend to agree that like you're gonna have way more efficacy. My only problem is the leap. Like, and then I just don't think it's a necessarily leap to be made. It's to say, you can show the footage and be like, you know, you should stop buying this. This is what's in your stores. You know, you should.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah.
have to make the leap to the principled point. You can just stay within the practical zone. Is to say, like, don't support this. This is what's going on. Don't support it. Um, and that would be fine. And then you can sort of make leanings towards principled points without just like trying to bamboozle someone into them. It's just to say that, you know, maybe we should consider that there is no good way to do this. But you can't just say, well, it follows from this footage that there is no way to do it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree that if you say, um, like, here's one specific example of something that is wrong, therefore there is no good way to do this. Um, but hold on, now I'm trying to think if someone could come to that conclusion from seeing that. Like, let's say that, and this is maybe a bit embarrassing. Like, here's a story of me from when I was younger. Um, like, let's say that someone like me is just is just completely in the dark about where animal products come from. Like when you eat chicken, you don't even realize that it comes from chicken the animal. Like when you think like chicken nuggets, like you just think, okay, yeah, like that's the food that you buy from the grocery store, and like chickens on the farm, yeah, those are the things that like they cluck and they lay eggs. And like seeing something like this, it could bring to your attention and kind of wake you up and make you realize, oh, look,
Uh-huh.
animals are being killed for the food that I'm eating. Like this is actually something that I'm aware of now. And if that causes someone to think like, okay, look, yeah, I am in principle against eating the meat from an animal um, because of seeing this footage, because I'm now aware of this, then I think in like a case like that, then maybe it could lead to a principled case.
I think I agree with you on that. I agree. It's just that like certain people do approach the Joeys and the voiceless, anonymous for the voiceless, with their own principled stance. They're like, no, I don't think it's in principle wrong, right? So that
Uh-huh.
wouldn't be somebody you would think that just hadn't thought about it, right? Like they have thought about it. They have a position they're willing to defend, and you know, like Joey won't even interact with it, right? He'll just keep pointing at the screen. He's like, I don't even want to hear what your argument is for the principled stance. I'm going to just keep pointing at the screen and telling you you're a monster.
Uh, that makes me think of something. And I guess this is a good opportunity to say this joke. I've been saying this joke for a while. I think I should set up a table. You know how people have those tables with the cloth with a message at the front?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I should set up one of those, and on the table it says, "People who have these signs that say 'Change my mind' don't want their minds changed. Change my mind."
No, yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. It's just yeah, the Crowder and Carb Strong, I just they don't look like they're actually willing to listen. They're just like, can I get somebody to sit down that I can proselytize to?
Um, Well, let me share some thoughts on that. What do I think about that? Well, like it definitely does get views. Like I even see with like new vegan activists. Like if you go on the street, you talk to people about this, and I imagine that it's true on both sides too, where it's like, how can I say this? Like for a lot of content, mm, yeah. Sorry, I'm not really going with this. It's just like I think that for certain types of content where it's like the viewers don't care about the truth, they just want someone to reaffirm that like they're making the right choice. They want someone to tell them, look, you, my audience, you are smart. The people opposing you, they are dumb. You are
Hmm,
wrong. Look how foolish they are being, and you are smart. Thank you for the support. And like we could see that on like almost any side of anything. I think whether it's like a moral issue or a political issue. And those seem to be the things that are getting um, a lot of attention. And if someone is holding a view like that, um, yeah, I don't know. I just hope that people do challenge their views. If someone like actually does challenge their views and they do still hold their position very strongly, then good for them. But it definitely, I think we could both agree that it definitely is better to welcome criticism and to listen to criticism of your position.
for sure. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the last question. I think that'll wrap us up. Is name the trait a useful tool? In what ways is it or is it not?
Yeah, fantastic question. I would definitely say that I think that name the trait is useful. There's a lot of value for using it, whether we are considering the person running name the trait, the audience that is listening to the discussion that is going on, or even in specific cases, the person that named the trait is being used against.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, what do you think name the trait? Like, I was gonna first say that I think name the trait is one of those tools that is on the principled end, right? It doesn't rely on any practical argumentation. So that's sort of like a point for it, is that it actually tries to address principled questions. Um,
Sorry, hold on. I'm not sure what exactly you mean by that. Like, are you saying that someone has to hold some principle when answering name the trait? I'm not sure if that's what you're saying
well,
or
I'm
not.
saying that the answers to name the trait would be like principles rather than like particular situations.
I don't think that that's necessarily the case because name the trait, it can be used on someone who is a particularist. Maybe we're talking past each other, but like name the trait can be used on a particularist who like doesn't hold any
Yeah, yeah.
universal principles, or even like a hard particularist who like doesn't even hold like any general principles to be true.
But yeah, but then it's almost a pointless conversation to be having, right? Because like
Um,
the entire response is the meta ethic.
Well, yeah, like in that specific case, and ask yourself. I actually had a really good conversation with Jack Angstrike. I think that's how it's pronounced on this, where he was using particularism arguments to answer, or sorry, he was answering name the trait as a particularist, and they were talking about what value does name the trait and the name the trait dialogue tree have for the people involved in the conversation or the people listening to the conversation, for if it's done with a particularist. And yeah, like even in that case, like I think that there still is value to the argument, even in a case with a particularist, like whether you're dealing with like a hardline particularist or a like complete universal uh, sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Or someone, a complete universalist. That's the word I'm looking for. Like anywhere in that range, I think that there is value to the dialogue.
Hmm. So what do you think like the goal of running the name trait should be? Like what should you get out of it?
Uh huh. Well, let me open this up. I've actually got the argument here, and the flow tree. Okay, so the conclusion of the argument, like if we just take a look at the conclusion of the argument, the conclusion is, therefore, your view can only deny the given non-human animal has moral value on pain of P and not P. Um, so I think that the conclusion of the argument is um, the conclusion of the argument is just that. So in a lot of cases, um, I think sometimes people try to prescribe some goal to name the trait that it doesn't have. Um,
Well, okay, so you're looking at the modus ponens that's written, and I've already written my criticisms on that, but I'm gonna put all of that to the side. Is to say that, look, if you say there's no moral principle between these things, and then you still say that there's a difference between them, you're contradicting yourself, right? Like, that's fine, but that's not how name the trait is used. It's not how it's because that argument doesn't establish a dialogue, right? Like that argument
um,
just concludes itself and then it's done. But where the interesting part is when somebody says, "Look, I think there is a difference," and then there's the conversation flow tree, the one that's attached to it.
wait, sorry. When you say name the trait isn't used that way when you're making reference to the modus ponens argument, are you saying that the way that is what you mean? The way that name the trait is used is that the discussion that takes place is what's written out in the dialogue flow tree?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, I'm following then. Okay.
then you can
So I'm gonna go grab the see if I can find the dialogue.
Oh, here, I could send you the link.
I think I got to it. Dialogue flow tree. All right. So to me, this is like the dialogue flow tree is what actually occurs in the
Okay.
conversation.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, like if the person does affirm the antecedent, then that shows that this is an argument that is meant to be run on that person or that can be run on that person. So the dialogue flow tree can follow. That's my understanding.
So what do you think like the goal of the dialogue flow tree is? Like when people come to the server and they have these chats or other people, like because I run into people on Reddit and whatnot, and they're constantly asking me, "Oh, name the trait," right?
Uh-huh.
And I'm trying to think like, what is it you want to get out of this, and like, what are the rules to this?
Okay, yeah. So if you say like what is the goal of this? Um, I don't know if I could say that there's one specific goal, but here are a few things that I think the person running name the trait would like to get out of this. Um, in a lot of cases where name the trait is used, like let's say for example somebody like let's say for example there's a debate going on. There's some audience listening to this.
Uh huh.
Some non-vegans, possibly some vegans listening to this, um, and the question is asked, um, like what moral value is true of animals that um, if true of or whatever way, if true of this, if not true of this, would justify killing one but not the other. um, a lot of the a lot of the responses that can be given to this dialogue end up resulting in pretty absurd examples. Like one answer that you'll hear people give very often, like if someone hasn't given any thought to this, I
Mm-hmm.
think that the answer that a lot of people will first intuitively give is that we're more intelligent than the animals.
Sure.
And if it's true that that is the only morally relevant trait, then it would follow that if we had a human that wasn't as intelligent, or if the human was as intelligent as whatever animal that they're okay with killing, then they would hold the same moral value, or roughly they'd hold about the same moral value for that human in that particular case. And that's a rather repugnant conclusion. That's something that people who are listening to that dialogue process would think, wow, you know what? No, that actually isn't a very good reason. No, like I wouldn't I wouldn't want to kill a marginal case human the same way that we kill cows. I wouldn't want a farm full of marginal case humans.
Hmm.
So I think one of the purposes of name the trait is to bring out absurdities or things that seem absurd like this to get the audience and also possibly the person involved in name the trait to consider if they do actually hold these values.
Sure, and no, and to me that's like the good part of name the trade. That's one of the parts like I appreciate. Like, yeah, I mean, in the same realm, that is just like Peter Singer's marginal cases, but this is more of an invitation to allow people to come and bring their own answers, whatever they may be. Um, but one of the problems is like, do you think there's any problem with someone going along in their day to day life and they don't have an answer to this question, right? I don't know what the difference is. I don't know why I make the moral decisions I do. I just do, right? Like, do you think implicit within the people who generally run Name the Trait is that, like, you're just not allowed to do that, or that there's something wrong with you if you're doing that?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Like,
Like, do you have
I
to
don't know
have
what
an
you mean
answer?
by.
Do you think you have to have an answer to name the trait um,
Um,
to be a moral human being?
um, Sorry, I'm not sure what's meant by moral human being, but before that, do you are you asking, um, can someone give as an answer to the if someone's asked the question, what is the trait that is true for name the trait? Can someone say I don't know? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know is a possible answer to the dialogue flow tree, and there is a response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm there right now. It says, if you do you know which trait defines this point? And if you answer no, it says you've been reduced to absurdity. You're uncertain of the moral status of all beings in between the trait equalization beginning and end points. So my question is, where's the absurdity?
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good question. This is something actually that when I first heard this, I'm like, I don't understand the absurdity of this. But it depends on how the answer is given, what exactly is meant by I don't know. So if someone asks, if someone says, okay, here's a series of possible worlds. In one world, we have cows, pigs, and chickens being farmed. In another world, we have humans being farmed. And in between, uh, we have the trade equalization process where we have some possible worlds where it like gradually transitions from one case to the other case.
Mm-hmm.
If someone says, I have absolutely no idea where value is lost, um, I think a lot of people that are listening to that um, I think name the trait does achieve its goal in reaching the audience in seeing an absurd conclusion and possibly the non-vegan in the debate with an example. Like if you're completely clueless about what beings have moral value, then you could give an example of like, let's say that there is a human and out of the bottom of the spine, there's like a tiny bit of a cow tail that has grown. Like, would something like that still have moral value?
Mm-hmm. So let's say, somebody gives sort of your standard responses and they're like, well, yeah, I think that would still have value. And they continuously get asked questions. And at some point, they're like, I just don't know anymore. Right? They're just like, you pushed me into some gray area. Now I'm just confused. Right?
Uh huh. So,
And
like, someone could. Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
and they're just like, but I can live with that confusion. Like, I just, this doesn't seem like something I need to answer.
Uh huh.
Then to
I
what
would.
absurdity were they reduced to?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, it would depend on what the traits were in the specific case. And someone
Well,
can give an
this is not somebody answering like traits. They're just like, because the person running name trade is asking these hypotheticals and just like, well, in that situation, it seems okay, and and then they just like, well, what were all the dividing factors? What were the traits that you were putting on that? And they go like, I don't know. I can only tell from the conclusion, from the hypothetical you give me. I don't even know what traits I'm leaning on to make these answers.
uh-huh. So are we saying that someone is answering name the trait and they're just they're saying I don't know what the trait is, and then excuse me, the vegan gives some specific examples, and the non-vegan's going, I'd kill that, I wouldn't kill that, that's okay, that's not okay.
Yeah,
And then they go, okay, yeah, I don't know what to conclude from this. Is that what we're saying the situation is?
yeah,
Yeah, so I would say in that specific case, there could be value to the people who are listening to name the trait here. Sorry, to people who are listening to this discussion. Like, let's say there's some non-vegan who is listening to this discussion. Like, whether they're a particularist or not a particularist,
hmm,
they can look at these specific cases that are coming up, and they could see, oh, look at that. Yeah, I agree with that case. Like, that would be wrong to kill. They might see another case and say, what? That person would be okay with killing that? No, that thing definitely has moral value. So it could cause the people who are listening it could cause the people who are listening to reflect on their own values and go, maybe there isn't some good maybe there isn't some good um, reason. Maybe I don't. Maybe that's a bit of a weird wording, saying there's a reason to have a value. I don't know if I have no idea at all if values need reasons, but someone could come to the conclusion. They could go, they could question whether they actually do value something sufficiently or not. And I think it also could happen to the person in the discussion as well as in the audience.
uh-huh,
But I would think that it's generally the case. Like, if two people are having a debate about something, um, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think people generally in a debate are less likely to change their mind while they're in the debate,
sure,
because
yeah,
it's just
probably.
like you're just focused on like defending your ego and defending your position, and you don't want to admit that you're wrong. And like maybe after some reflection, like sometime after, you'd go like, huh, maybe that actually was a good point, or like maybe it could also make you like cling even harder to your position. But I would think that I would think that it's generally the case, like not just with this debate, but with any kind of debate, that the audience is more likely to have their mind changed than the person in the discussion. And if just one more thing that I could add, sorry, I've been going on for a while. Um, I think that that's especially true if someone comes to this discussion with possibly an open mind, and they're kind of like on the fence about this kind of thing. Then I think people like that would probably be the most likely to be persuaded one way or another.
Sure, sure. So because I want to agree that there is some sort of reflective value with the process. But what I want to push back on is the whole you've been reduced to absurdity. Do you think this person has actually been reduced to absurdity? Because you might find that the majority of people just agree with them.
Oh, that's a very good question. It depends on what is meant by absurdity. Like absurdity, according to who or according to what, right?
Hmm.
Like if we're talking about if we're talking about like what the vegans values are, then like obviously, like from the start of the conversation, like we
Yeah,
could have
exactly,
known that
exactly. You didn't
v-
even need to do name the trait.
yeah. But in other cases, I don't know if I could say that it's true in every single case, but I think like in a lot of cases of what I've seen of name the trait,
Uh huh.
I
Well, sure.
you
Like
do get
I'll
some.
agree with you. Like a lot of the stock answers of intelligence or tradition or canines or just whatever, right? They all tend
Yeah,
to end
yeah.
up being shitty answers.
Yeah, well, sorry. I just want to add one thing to that. Yeah, so it's those answers end up being absurd, but absurd not only just to vegans, but to other people who are like not vegan, like people who are not vegan and have never even thought about veganism,
No,
like
I agree.
they would like they would think that a lot of these answers are absurd.
But yeah, I guess where I want to push back is I think the person who says I don't know and only has general ideas, I don't think they fall in the realm of absurd to other non-vegans.
Well, I think in that case, it depends specifically on the conversation. Like if someone says, "I have absolutely no idea," and they go, "Well, what about if a human had like a little bit of a cow tail starting to grow?" And they're like, "Yeah, I still don't know if that have moral value." Then I think I would think that like in that case, like people would go, "Yeah, that's pretty absurd." Like if I gave well, not if I gave birth, I can't give birth, but like if I had a child and it had like a little bit of a cow tail, like I'm not going to be like, this is an abomination, I have to eat this, like that just I
Sure.
don't know, I think that's pretty insane.
No, yeah, yeah, I think that's fair, but like to more steelman the position is it's not like just this complete unknown, but it's also like it contains some gray area where where they can affirm, well, I wouldn't kill that and I wouldn't kill that, but I might kill that. I don't know. Like when it gets kind of gray and most non-vegans would agree that it's gray, then I don't think there's an absurdity to be found there.
Okay, so hold on, if I'm understanding, I think that you're saying that there is a that like there can be a specific case where a non-vegan says, I don't know, I don't know what the trait is. And you're saying that there can be some kind of discussion where the non vegan says, I'm okay with this case, I'm okay with this case, I'm not okay with this, not okay with this. And the conclusions overall would not seem absurd to non vegans that are listening. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Maybe that possibly could be the case. Like I guess we'd have to see an example for me to be able to agree that yeah, there can be an example of where that is the case, and I think that the majority of non-vegans wouldn't find it absurd. But I think, yeah, like we both agree that like in the majority, uh, in like a lot of answers that we see to name the trait, they do lead to the audience thinking that the conclusion is absurd.
Hmm.
But I think what we are just not in agreement with, and what I'm not sure of, is if there is a specific case in which some answers could be given that would not seem too absurd to a non-vegan audience. Is that? Do you think that's a good characterization of where we're at right now?
I think there's like certain levels of just saying you don't know that don't lead to absurdities, to just not knowing the difference, right? Like you said, maybe an absolute not knowing would seem absurd, but there's a certain amount of gray, a certain amount of unknowingness you could put into this and say, well, I still think it's okay to kill animals, and I don't think it's okay to kill people, and no, I don't know all the traits in between, but you know, I generally have the same moral intuitions that most people do about situations. It's just like I don't think that would ever come across as absurd.
Hmm. I don't know. To agree, I'd have to see an example of that being the case of like specific answers given in this specific dialogue and how I would think that people would respond to that.
Okay. And then at the bottom of the conversation tree, you see, do you maintain the trait is X despite its reductio? And it says yes. If you say yes, you've been reduced to absurdity, which seems to implicate that there is no answer. Like he's stating right here that no matter what you say, you're absurd.
Hmm. Um, well, do you think that there is a trait that doesn't lead to um, something that something that a non-vegan audience that is listening would think is absurd?
Well, I mean, we can lean this into to the last thing is, do you think there's anything about the position I've put forth that leads to absurdity?
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, so we could go through this dialogue process right now then. Um, yeah, so I've read about what traits you like I think I've read about what traits you would have given as an answer to name the trait before. And I know like you've had a conversation with like vegan gains before, and I think you said like you've changed your position on like some of your thoughts since you've had
Yeah.
your conversation with him. So, what answer would you give to name the trait? Like, why do you think that it's okay to kill cows, chickens, pigs, fish, um, and eat their meat, but you're not okay with doing that for humans? Like, if yeah, the whole name the trait.
Yeah. So I have three things and you can find this in my wiki page. Is
Okay.
there's these three answers. One is just humanity, which is to say that they're human, or they seem human. They seem so much like a human that I would think they were a human. Now, and
Okay.
we can go into that. The second one is the self awareness, and that's to say that you understand your life, basically existentially. Like you understand the meaning of your life and your future, and you kind of conceptualize it in that way. And those are the two things that I put for rights to life. Then I also put a utilitarian principle for animals, which is to say that, like, while it might be okay, like they don't have the right to life, that doesn't mean they you can inflict undue suffering. Um, so you can't just like beat or abuse or torture animals. And the principle that I write for the utilitarianism is, if you're going to farm them, it should be better or equal to the utilitarian value of nature.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So like the conditions of the animal and the way in which it's killed would have to be overall better than the life that it would have had if it were in nature.
Yeah, better or equal to. Like you can't do worse than it.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I could follow that then. Okay. So let's see. Um okay, could I just want to get a better understanding of and I'm sorry to do this. I don't think you like this. I don't want to harp on this point for too long. But like when you say something is human or seems human,
Mhm.
like, do you mean that it's something that if I looked at this thing or if I interacted with this thing, then I would be able to tell that it is a human, and anything that fits that criteria does have moral protection from being farmed? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah. So it is actually a human, or would remind you so much of a human that you would think it was.
Okay, so you would say so you would use that in gray areas, specifically like there's some pig that gradually, as we move through these possible worlds in the trade equalization process, that at some point it looks enough like a human that you become uncomfortable with having those things in a farm. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, yeah, I think that would be fair to say.
Okay. Um, with the point, okay, so the three traits then were humanity, um,
Self-awareness.
self awareness, and it being treated well enough, basically, like in a utilitarian calculation. Yeah. So my okay. So here would be my response to that. Let's see. Hopefully, I can reduce you to absurdity. um, so the first thing that I would have to push back on is sorry. Let me take a look at this question. Let me just make sure I get this right. Um, Okay, so you're saying, or I'm saying, if all traits true of a given human are matched to those of a given non-human animal. Okay, so let me look at this specifically with the self-awareness trait, because I think there's going to be a point of disagreement here. Let me just make sure that I say this correctly.
Okay.
Um, Okay, so if all traits true of a given human are switched to match those of a given non human animal. So when you give the trait of self awareness, Um,
Well, do we
that
agree? We agree we can't actually do that with the humanity trait, right?
hold on, sorry. Could we just focus on this
Sure,
before we go to that?
sure.
Okay. Um, so when we're saying all traits true of a given human are switched to match those true of a given non-human. So when you say that one of the traits is self-awareness,
Uh-huh.
um, you are saying that self-awareness is true of a human, and cows, chickens, pigs, fish, that is false of them. They do not have self-awareness. Is that right?
Correct. I mean,
Okay.
so long as the given human, like you can make a given human that doesn't, but yeah, so long as we're starting with like your average everyday human.
Okay. And is this a necessary trait? Like, would you say that if animals were self-aware, then they would have a sufficient moral consideration to make it immoral to kill them?
It's a sufficient trait, not a necessary trait.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah, that's what I meant. You're right. Okay, so that's a sufficient trait. Okay, so yeah, what I would have to do here is yeah, and I'm not well read enough on this to make a strong case for this right now. Someone who is more well read on this topic could definitely make a better argument than me. So I won't be able to get very far in this. But I would have to say that I disagree that the trait self-awareness is false of a non-human animal, and that's an empirical claim. So we'd have to
Hmm.
um, well, I don't know how we'd be able to verify or falsify that. Like if we take a look at like behavior or brain structures or something. But
Yeah,
yeah,
and
I'm
I mean
I'm
that's one thing we could get into, but like for the sake of the argument, it'd probably be like it would be long and but well, I agree with you. You could attack it empirically. You could try and show me that I'm wrong about that, or you could show me that I'm wrong about specific animals, but maybe not other ones, right? And that's a fine way of attacking the position. But let's just say that I am right, right, in the way that I've empirically stated this. That in fact there is like maybe humans and elephants and dolphins are among the only self-aware creatures, and other ones are not, right? Where would you move with the argument if that was true?
but before we go there, because the original question was if I could show that the position leads to some absurdity, and by show that it leads to absurdity, we're talking about like to a non-vegan audience that is listening to this. So
Uh-huh.
like so on this specific point, before we say that we hypothetically grant that, um, let's say that there is someone who could make a better argument than me for the fact that animals are in fact sentient. Um,
You mean
like if
self-aware?
someone, yeah, sorry, self-aware. If someone can make a better argument than me for that,
Uh-huh.
and they do convince the audience that that is the case,
Yeah.
then I would think in that specific case that the audience members who are listening that they would like from that conclusion they could reflect on their values and then name the trait would achieve its goal in that specific case. Would you agree with that?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, like, if I was convinced by the speaker that they were self-aware, then, I'd be willing to change my position.
Uh-huh. Well, hopefully, I'm sure all the vegans would be very happy if you can have a conversation with someone that's able to do that for you.
Uh-huh.
But sorry, yeah, so back to the conversation. Okay, yeah, so um yeah, if I was more well read on this topic, I think that's where I would go. But yeah, if that were granted, if animals were not self-aware, so then if we were just saying that animals um, don't feel like if it doesn't mean anything to be an animal, like if it's basically just a machine that grows meat that we can harvest.
Well,
um,
that's not necessarily where I'm going with that.
Oh yeah,
because
sorry. I don't wanna straw man your
like
position.
like
Sorry. If you could let me know what it would mean to not be self-aware. Sorry, I don't mean to
so it would be
make
like
your position sound.
yeah, you can still be like an in the moment creature. You have pleasures and sufferings and like these sorts of things, but you don't like conceptualize yourself. You don't tell yourself a story about yourself. So like the whole psychological story that we have wrapped up in language about ourselves, that talks about, the sort of person I am, the sort of place I am in the world, the future that I want to have. These sorts of things that are wrapped up in language are what I mean by self-awareness. So it's like what allows a human to have existential crises and talk about morality and like that sort of reasoning that escapes animals.
Okay, sorry. So, let me just make sure I'm understanding this. So, if we can say that the trait of self-awareness is false. One example of the trait of self-awareness being false could be an animal that still does feel pleasure and pain, but just in the moment, but it doesn't have like an idea of itself. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm really understanding this.
No, I found the question confusing actually.
Okay, yeah, sure. Sorry. So, the question is, what exactly, or could you give me a specific instance of the trait self-awareness being false in an animal? So, what would it mean to have a non self-aware animal? What could it? I don't know if experience is the right word. Like, could it have an experience?
It could have an experience, right? So like an emotional experience or a pain pleasure experience. The experience it would be lacking is the sorts of thoughts of like, I'm an animal and in one day in the future I want to accomplish this, and like these sorts of stories that you tell about yourself. Like I'm saying they don't do that.
Hmm. I'm thinking if that were the case, like if we were saying that an animal um, has those things true of it, yeah, this will be an empirical claim. So I would still think that people would that I would think that a non-vegan audience might disagree with that and might see that as absurd. If we could say that an animal like doesn't have a story about itself but still can feel pleasure and pain, that it would be wrong to do that. I think some non-vegans listening to that would reflect or could reflect on their values from hearing something like that, and then name the trait. The goal of name the trait could be achieved for these specific people.
I do think at the moment I hold the majorative position though.
You would think that more people would, that more non-vegans after hearing this would not think that that is absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they would just agree with me.
Uh-huh. Let me think about that.
I mean, I can say even from my experience of talking to non-vegans about these principles, I convince almost everybody. I mean, it might be motivated reasoning.
Destroying all the vegans.
It might
Um,
be motivated reasoning because they just want to hear somebody give a reason that sounds plausible to do whatever they feel like doing. But regardless if it's that or not, the majority of people just end up agreeing with me.
uh-huh. Um, yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't think that. I think this would be a point of disagreement, and like I guess we'd have to look at empirical data to convince ourselves or to convince each other one way or another.
Hmm.
But I would think that I would think the opposite way on this point. I think that if you say that there's an animal that it doesn't have like a story of itself in its mind. Sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. I don't want to make it
No,
sound
that
like
sounds fine. That sounds fine.
okay, yeah. Like if an animal doesn't have like a story of itself in its mind, but like it still can experience um, pleasure and pain, then I think that I think that non-vegans would um, possibly reflect on their values after hearing something like that. But
I would
as for
gladly
whether
challenge you on it, but sure.
okay, oh well, sorry, hold on. Here's the point. This is an interesting point because you said the majority would agree with you. That's a good point. That I don't know. I don't know if I would agree on, but sure. I think you can grant that there there are at least some non-vegans who could reconsider their position and like challenge their values and think, you know, I actually don't agree with that after hearing a conversation like that. Like you could agree with that, right?
Sure, but I would also go in the other way and say that there's some vegans who might think that makes sense and stop being vegan.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it too. Um, yeah, so I don't know if the goal of name the trait I I don't want to try to give I don't want to try to set a bar for name the trait that is higher than what the bar was meant to be. I don't know like what percentage of people, what percentage of non-vegans are supposed to think that a certain reductio is absurd. Um, I think we can agree that for different reductios for different traits, there would be different percentages of non-vegans who would find the reductio absurd.
Uh-huh.
Um, and for this specific case, yeah, I guess just the only disagreement then is what percentage of non-vegans would find that particular conclusion absurd. Is that fair to say?
Sure.
Okay, that's
But I'll
perfect.
stand by the point that I think I have the vast majority.
Um, okay, yeah. I'll still be agnostic on that position.
That's fair.
If I see more cases, if I see lots of cases where that does work very well, then yeah, I'm open to accepting that the majority of non-vegans, if given the reductio of some specific trait stack, would not find that absurd. I'm open to accepting that.
Okay.
If I if I like hypothetically saw some good evidence for that, or if from my experience I found that that was the case. But other than that, yeah, I think we're pretty much in agreement then.
Okay. So do you think that's the only attackable place within the values I've set out?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah, so that would be my first um, that would be my first thoughts for how I would go about responding to that. Now let me think. Um, hmm. I guess let me think how reasonable this would be. Hmm. Yeah, right now that's the only way that I could. That's the only thought out like attack that I would have against that position if I would want to have a like let's say sorry, let me restart that. If I'm having a discussion with somebody who named the traits that you named,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, and this is kind of weird. It's like we're having this conversation right now, and I'm saying if I was hypothetically having this conversation with someone right now,
If I was
um,
hypothetically doing exactly what I was doing right
yeah,
now,
yeah.
this is what I would do.
um, yeah. So if someone gave these traits and I wanted to give a reductio on this position that I think would get non-vegans to possibly reconsider their position and challenge their values, then that's the way that I would go about it. I can't think of another way to go about it right now. There might be another way to go about it, but yeah, that would be my first route that I take.
Okay. All right. I guess that would bring us to the conclusion. We've been going for, I think, 2 hours and 20 minutes. So
Oh damn! Yeah, it's like getting dark now.
that's quite a bit of content. Is there anything you want to like finish with?
No, I just want to say thanks. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I always like having you conversation with you. I'm glad to have had you for this, and we'll put this on later. And to anybody listening and who's gotten through this, visit Food Five Thought to see if subscribe to see if any new videos come out. And you can also find me on YouTube, Shadow Starshine, which you probably already did if you're listening to this.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming by. Bye
Yeah,
bye.
thanks for having me. See you.